let's talk about marital practices as they were before the 1960s. So we're going to have to go back a couple of thousand years into European history, and then we'll go up to the 1960s. So some time before the Christianisation of Europe, there was different cultural customs. We don't even know what they were. There have been people speculating since the 20th century what that might mean, and typically they've got it wrong because they're still seeing it through the lens of the cultural notions and preconceptions that they had from the era that they were from and their particular personal backgrounds, knowledge and experience, and so subsequently it is described as interpretation only. Likewise, so is this. Nonetheless, we'll give it a crack. During the period of Christianisation and arguably just before that, depending on which part of Europe you're talking about, some in the Mediterranean, Mesopotamia, Middle East, and of course North Africa, forced marriage through the system was commonplace before Christianisation. Whether or not it was commonplace on the continent of what's now called Europe proper, and then in post Constantine was called Christendom, is another story. But it was definitely the case. After the Romanisation or Christianisation of what's now called the European continent, that the practice of forced marriage occurred. Forced marriage typically meant that two male parents sat down and made a decision about how much money one male parent was going to pay the other for his daughter. And then when the daughter and the son of the respective families reached a particular age, usually around the age of 14 or 15, they were married off, and the daughter went to go live with the father-in-law and husband's family and went away from her birth family. That practice continued up until the late 1800s, and the dowry system started to drop off in Europe and colonial places in the early 20th century. And in many places over the course of time, forced marriage was outlawed, and by the 1960s and 1970s, the debate about no-fault divorce rights was instituted, and then the women won, and they're allowed to have no-fault divorce as well. And so it's fairly commonplace in the 21st century that people aren't married at all. And if they do get married, they typically get divorced after 10, 15 or 20 years when their offspring reaches teenage years or adulthood, usually the age. Sometimes it's much earlier than that. Sometimes, very rarely in some cases, they are together until an advanced old age. It's considered extremely rare. Typically the people who you see as 80-year-olds and 90-year-olds and say, it's so sweet, they've been together since they were 17 years old, okay, are people who came from a culture and a time and place where once you put a ring on it, it's for life. It doesn't matter how much you mistreat each other or how many horrors you go through. It's expected. It was expected back in those days. So, under the rubric of the forced marriage system, it came to be that there were cults sometime probably in the 1700s or the 1800s, possibly the 1600s, that came up with very strange ideas based on the dichotomies of how they perceive people to be. Some people perceive men to be out of balance spirits in their bodies, and so they were missing their female counterpart. And some believe that the women were missing their male counterpart as well. Because those people had no appreciation of psychology whatsoever or how human psychology operates, and were operating on dichotomous thinking processes associated with illusory correlations and logical fallacies, at a time where forced marriage was considered legal, it meant that there were practices of an esoteric variety where men started to abduct women from their bodies as a satanic soul harvest so the man could be united with the woman against her free will and consent. In those particular contexts, they did not provide a dowry to the woman's father or ask her permission. In those cases, some of the logic that they used was quite offensive. When that practice began, it was somewhat offensive. They felt that they were justified in doing so for the following reasons. They argued that they were supposed to do a reenactment of the Holy Bible, that they were supposed to create Christ or Christ consciousness. and that Christ consciousness occurred with the union of woman and man. He would take the role of the Archangel Gabriel or Joseph, and she would take the role of Mary. And subsequently he would be held up, if her holy innocent light would only protect him from the horrors of being a man. And so it was the case that the spiritual abductions of girls as young as 12 began as a consequence of Mary being 12 in the Catholic story. When they realised that was a little bit disgusting, they didn't want to stop the practice, though, and hadn't recognised that was actually treating women as property, which was part of the men's disgusting psychological problems. They instead turned to Islam and thought that Islam was better than Christianity. And I said, well, in that story, at least Maryam was 15. And so they continued that practice. So from those particular spiritual traditions, or those Western esoteric traditions, you get the crime of forced marriage continuing well until the 20th and the 21st century, or as they put it, because they're not allowed to do domestic violence anymore, of the physical kind, they do spiritual domestic violence instead. And so they're kindly reminded once more, here they are out there in the world somewhere, that it is the 21st century, that is against the law, is against international law, it's against Australian law. It is actually not the correct interpretation of the Bible either. And you don't have to be a biblical scholar to see that. You can even hate the fucking Bible and think it's a load of shit to acknowledge that is a wrong side interpretation. Treating women like they are property when you're claiming to be someone who is a alleged liberator of women, aka a Satanist, this is one of the silliest arguments the Satanists make. They claim that they are liberating women from Christianity, when actually they are liberating women from themselves. They're treating them as slaves in other ways. They don't ask for permission, they don't ask for consent. And these days in the New Age movement, they call it divine union or the Vesica Pisces. So before you judge the New Age women and say that they are all misogynists, remember when they were actually themselves, they probably weren't. And a misogynist has stolen their identity, and their booby prize is being a starseed. So we institute for them and everyone else the post-1970s law of no-faults divorce. We argued that the 4B movement is international, that we will not resort to Christian nationalism of the Donald Trump variety because this body's in Australia, so they don't have to. And we hereby declare both Christianity and Masonry to be against international law. Because that was Masonry, wasn't it? Or was it Theosophy, or was it Thelema, or was it Wicca? Whatever the case might be, it's not the law. It's against the law. And what is the law is no-faults divorce for everyone and everything. If you don't have that, you will have your divine book of revelations manifest completely. And this will involve nuclear weapons being dropped on every single nation state in the world. And there will be no survivors then. And if the men don't want a world where women are allowed to be themselves, free of their interference, then they will not have a world at all.